Welcome to everybody who's streaming with us. We're very, very excited about this conversation we're going to have between Sally and John and you and me. Before we begin, I want to say to everyone who may be visiting with us that we're thrilled you're here. We have red welcome bags at the welcome table and also right outside the door here of this building. They contain flyers about what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes. Also, some brochures that describe all the different ministries at All Saints. If you'd like to be on the mailing list, I ate a piece of chocolate really fast, pardon me. If you'd like to be on the mailing list and get the email blast that I send out every Thursday about what's coming about in this room and also around the campus every Sunday, we'd love to have you sign up. And you can do that through the welcome cards that are all over the place, including at the welcome table today. And also, I think, Susan, we're going to have sign-ups here on the table too. I think they'll be there, green sheets where you can sign to be on the mailing list. If you'd like to be a part of making all of this happen financially, we need absolutely every penny we can get. So we'd love for you to be a pledging member of All Saints Church. And you can do that at the giving table and also send us a word and we'll get you a pledge card. Now, there are flyers coming around that look like this. They're yellow at the top. This is coming early 2015. And it contains information about 4 amazing thinkers who either will be here in person, 3 of them will be, or will have access to the videos of Richard Rohr. And it starts this coming Saturday. And these events are going to be in a concentrated period of time and will end the weekend of February 7 and 8. And I want each of you to come to everything, to all of it. And I know I'm asking a lot. And it's because you'll be different as a result. You'll be a better human being as a result of coming. Because what we're going to try to do is take a few strides forward in thinking about creating a new narrative for the human race and for the human family and for all of us as individuals. One of our early speakers, David Corton, has actually written a book that directly talks about having a new story. And he recalls in his introduction being around Marcus Borg once, who said, "Tell me who your God is, and I will tell you what your politics are." Because the story you tell yourself about God is the story you tell yourself about in terms of your citizenship and your responsibility as a citizen, both in this country and the world. It was a turning point for David Corton, who is an economist and cares about economic justice for all, and also cares that we have a story that not only helps us have an economically just system by which to live, but also to have a story that helps us stop the degradation of this planet Earth. So he's written a book about it that will tickle all of you who are interested in economic justice, as well as scratch the deep itch of you who care about the climate crisis in which we live. So toward the end of this presentation, we'll talk about the specific times that these people are going to come and speak. But we want to spend the first few minutes of this talking about this whole business of a new story, a new narrative, a story that can heal and transform and turn the human race into the human family. Now, this is not brand new. The Psalms tell us to sing a new song. Walter Brueggemann has told us that the sign of God's presence is newness, and that when oftentimes we are in touch with our pain, and we are in touch publicly with our pain, that's a threshold for the newness that God is bringing us. All of Marcus Borg's work has been talking about an old paradigm versus an emerging paradigm. Walter Brueggemann, this Old Testament scholar, which I've just mentioned, talks about the imperial story versus the prophetic story, the story of the dominating empire versus the universal story of the prophets. And psychology. The world of psychology has been talking about a new narrative, a coherent narrative, etc. Now, this is where I'm going to pull in Sally and John. Before Sally speaks about this business of a healing narrative or a coherent narrative, secure-based narrative, I want to simply remind those of you who don't know Sally, she's a priest on our pastoral care staff. She's also a psychoanalyst, and she's heading up all sorts of new initiatives here at All Saints, having to do with our healing ministry, and also because of her interfaith background, a lot of our interfaith work. John, sitting to her right, is the director of all formation and education from cradle to grave here at All Saints Church. And he oversees many of these programs out of his office. His office is developing the adult formation education roadmap. He, with his colleagues in the CYF department, the Children, Youth, and Families department, oversee expressing and making real the roadmap that we developed 2 years ago, I think, for children and teenagers formation and education at All Saints. All three of us come from a narrative or a story religiously that is what some call not a generative story, but rather a story that has some toxic development parts, ingredients in it. So all three of us not only have the commonality of working here on the same staff, but also of having a lot of passion about creating a new, healthy narrative that heals us and that heals everybody else. So Sally's going to take the mic and talk a little bit about this business of narrative and how important it is for you and me from a psychoanalytic perspective. John's going to talk about John Philip Newell's work, Richard Rohr's work. Sally will add in some about that. And then I'm going to talk about the coming of my neuroscience teacher to do a special retreat here. So, Sally, will you begin?
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see all of you today. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of attachment theory and coherent narrative. And part of the reason I love talking about it is that we know a lot more about those things because of the infant research that's been done over the last 30 or 40 years by people they now call baby watchers. But the amazing thing about us as human beings, or one of the amazing things, is that we are really meaning makers from even before we're born. Our brains are wired to put things together so that at birth, and many of you may know this from your own experience, that when babies are born, they recognize the voice, usually of both parents. And within like 3 days, and babies are only awake, 6 or 7 hours during those days, they recognize the mother's face from all other faces within 3 days. So we are putting things together, making little mini stories really from the time that we're born. By 9 months, babies who have mothers who are depressed already treat every adult as if they're depressed. So we have this just amazing ability to put things together and make meaning from before birth. Now, one of the most important stories that we develop are attachment stories, and those are about how important people relate to us. And we know that when babies feel seen, safe, and understood, they develop a confidence about being known and loved, and develop a story of intimacy and closeness, that feels safe, and that they're comfortable with a lot of their experience, both the negative and the positive. And so when they grow up, they tend to have stories that are coherent, that have both of those kinds of experiences in them. And as we get older, we put lots of other stories together. They become more elaborate and more complex until we develop our sacred narratives. And that's part of what we're talking about today, and wanting to have sacred narratives that are actually coherent, that have a sense of secure base in a loving presence, and that can include both the positive and the painful aspects of our lives. And so I want to talk a little bit just about, coherent narrative and what that's about. Again, we've learned a lot about that in our research. And this came out of people asking adults to tell the story of their childhood. Now, that doesn't seem like that would be, such a hard thing to do, right, to tell a story. But what we found out is that a surprising number of people really don't have or have a hard time telling something that hangs together, that makes sense and has some internal kind of consistency. Sometimes important parts are missing, or it might be a story, but it's kind of self-condemning or critical and unfair, or sometimes a story that only tells the positive. And we have found that helping people develop a coherent story is really important to a sense of well-being and what we call self-regulation, where both parts of your brain, your right and your left, are working together. And that it's also very, very important for our children. And this is where some of the hope is, and I think some of the power of this new story that we're developing, theologically. Because if you, as an adult, can develop a sense or telling a story about yourself that includes these larger narratives that kind of hangs together, the result is that your children end up being securely attached. And it doesn't matter what happened to you as a child, meaning even if your own background or your own religious narrative wasn't one that was of a secure, loving base, if you develop a coherent narrative yourself, your children will have a sense of security and well-being. And so, I think some of the implications for us as, a parish is this work we're doing to move from, and the three of us share, a background of a very toxic view of God who needed to kill God's own son in order to forgive somebody. This new narrative that includes the unity of everybody and the love of God has the power not only to transform our lives, our own lives and our sense of well-being, but for future generations. So it's a really exciting, I think, powerful thing that we're about and we're doing.
Great. So John Dephouse.
Good morning. It's good to be here. Sally's covered the cradle and childhood, so I'm going to try to take us to the grave. So buckle up. I woke up with this quote that came to mind this morning. And this is a thought that comes from a Jesuit priest, I believe, Anthony DeMello. He's a priest, I think. And it just sums up so well, I think, a lot of what Richard Rohr is talking about in the Conspire work. He says this: prayer, love, spirituality, and religion are about ridding yourself of illusions. When religion brings that about, that's wonderful, wonderful. When it deviates from that, it is an illness, a plague to be avoided. Once illusions have been abandoned, the heart is unobstructed and love takes hold. That's when happiness occurs. That's when change takes place. And only then will you know who God is. And that's from Anthony DeMello. And it reminds me of Richard Rohr in this past Conspire conference said this provocative statement that no culture can survive if it hates its religion. And that's where we are right now. No culture can survive if it hates its religion. And I think that's a provocative statement, but that has so much truth to it. The more I constantly talk to people outside of faith communities, outside of All Saints, any kind of church or religious setting, I'm amazed at the consistent sense of forming a narrative, having a spiritual journey, but yet operating as an isolated self, having no place to safely have facilitated this kind of unobstructed process of change and transformation. And in this, again, in the Conspire work, Richard Rohr quotes this wonderful interreligious author, Ken Wilber, who says that religion has the potential to be a conveyor belt, which takes people not to advancing in their religion, to be the masters of our own cocoons, if you will, but to move us forward in stages of consciousness, in depth of seeing, in really deep transformation towards the values of which we're talking about. I love what Ed quoted in the sermon today from Dr. Mahir Hathout, that when we emerge out of the cocoons of our religion, we really can see God. And that doesn't mean that we stay out of the cocoons of our religion. We can come back home to a base of where we are formed, where our kind of religious imaginariums are just real, and that which we cannot change. But we are in those traditions and stories with new eyes, with the ability to see humanity in broader strokes. And I want to quote Ilia Delio in this past conference as well. She said that Christians should be renamed as whole makers. That's really what Christians are about at their base. And unfortunately, the name Christian, to us, may be relatively okay. We talk about a healthy brand of Christianity here. But to droves and droves of people in our culture, if you say Christian, there are all kinds of narratives that are attached to being a Christian. How many of you know family and friends who just will not walk into a church because of this reality? It's everywhere still. We may take for granted the kinds of health and life-giving stories that we get here, but our job doesn't stop here. This needs to go out to far and wide, to a lot of people who are very hungry for a different story. And I want to go back to Rob Bell in the Conspire work. He shared a story at this conference of just his tumultuous journey of being crucified publicly for saying that people aren't going to go to hell when they die. And, you know, it's kind of a, not too advanced of a thought for many of us here, but nonetheless, he really got crucified by a big part of the populace. And he said this great thought that if you can work through the worst that humans can offer you, you are one dangerous person. Come out better on the other end. And so I think about this as a lot of this process of coherent narrative and writing a new story and a new song comes through all kinds of tumult and trial and struggle. And this is the work that we cannot do alone, and the work yet that we really want to do. And so I think all of these events, in one way or another, is about that work and being together in space where we can tell our stories, where we can hear new life-giving insights and truths that help us to take the next steps and the next steps and the next steps. So I'm really excited about it. I don't know if you could tell, but so yeah, buckle up. We're going cradle to grave.
Everybody get a microphone. So, John, let me toss it back to you. Talk a little bit about the transcend and include thing, because I think that's going to be an important mindset for us to have when we're talking about a new story, that we're not talking about denigrating old stories.
Yes, transcend and include. So Richard Rohr uses a phrase called our religious imaginariums, meaning the religious settings of which we were raised, or not religious at all. Whatever we are raised with are archetypes and stuff that gets formed in us in the first 8 to 10 years of life. And we can't get rid of it. You know, if we were raised Catholic, the images of Catholicism, they will not leave our consciousness. They will be in there forever. And so some people talk about, say phrases like recovering evangelical or recovering Catholic. And we have this sense of, I am leaving that behind and I'm going forward. But sometimes in our leaving that behind, we leave an exhaust of hatred and of resenting and criticizing and standing above where we were before. And Richard Rohr is saying, no, that doesn't work. We have not advanced at all if we are moving forward with criticism, hatred, loathing in our hearts towards whatever religious stage that we've come from. So transcend and include means that nothing is wasted. Your Catholicism, your evangelicalism, your whatever you've come from is not wasted in God's economy. It's part of the story, part of the narrative, which moving forward can be incorporating in a way in which we can look back with compassion and with loving eyes rather than with condescension or with hateful eyes. So that's what I think of when I think of transcend and include.
Yeah, and can I say something around that? I think there is this amazing way where there's such a convergence between interdisciplinary things and interfaith. And, you know, one of the things in coherent narrative is being able to develop a compassionate stance towards oneself and also one's parents, one's family. So it really, I think, has these amazing parallels with some of what Rohr is talking about.
So let's go 1, 2, 3. John, if you'll talk about the Rohr whole conspire thing and what we're doing with this particular showing, and set us up a little bit to talk about John Philip Newell. Then Sally, who has a personal relationship with John Philip Newell, will talk a little bit more about that. I've already mentioned David Corton, but I want to spend about 5 minutes talking about the neuroscientist Dan Siegel and what he's going to do for us. And we'll tell you how to register for all of this stuff. And then we'll open it up for Q&A, okay? So, Rohr?
Yeah, nuts and bolts of the Conspire work here at All Saints. This coming Saturday, January 10, we're doing a reviewing of the video teachings which we showed last year. The same teachings, same kind of setup. It's going to be a Richard Rohr Marathon Saturday, and you won't want to miss it. We'll come and start at about 9 o'clock in the morning, 8:30. We'll have some breakfast goodies and coffee, and then we'll start showing the videos, have about 30 minutes or so of discussion and reflection afterwards, just to process a little bit. And then the day will finish at about 2 o'clock. And this is just the beginning of the work. I think to hear the content and to have some superficial or deeper level understanding of the content is just the first step. And then beyond that, as we put ourselves in spaces where we can really turn the stuff over and allow it to be incorporated into our lives. And so in Lent, we're going to have Conspire book groups, as well as some other books that will be added to that list, where you can get into a book group for a period of the course of Lent and be reading this content and be talking about it amongst fellow pilgrims in this journey. So there's the book groups. And then on May 31, 2-day event, Sunday to Monday, we're going to have the next round of the Conspire videos. We'll probably choose about 3 or 4, probably 4 of the teachings from the conference that we just attended, which they were all absolutely fantastic. And we will be showing those to all of you, and then continuing this journey into the next year, and into the next year, into the next year, because this is a long process as we kind of ground the journey of change that we're on. So that's the Conspire work.
Great. John Philip Newell will also be here. He's been here before. He is a Celtic scholar, and I first became familiar with him through an interfaith retreat that he did with a rabbi and Sufi woman in Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. And if we have time today, I'll tell you a little bit about my experience, but he is talking about rebirthing our story of God, and that the Christian household needs to complete the story rather than compete with other faith traditions. And that we need the God in us to adore the God in each other. So he's going to come and talk with us about that. He's an amazing guy.
All of these books are going to be for sale, and this newest book from John Philip Newell, he argues that Western religious tradition, that tradition is over. It's had its day. And what we need to do is to replace it with something that's much more inclusive, much more healing, and I'm very excited about you and us. And this is going to be the bonus here. It's not just that we are going to be sitting at the feet of some world-class thinkers, but you and we are going to be talking about it. We're going to be reflecting on it, which is going to make the take-home even greater. So that's why I really want you all to be present here. We're not streaming any of this stuff. It's kind of one of those things where we want you to be here, except for the Sunday morning stuff. We'll always be streaming that. And the Conspire thing is for free. The Corton thing is free, but the John Philip Newell thing costs $10. And then the Dan Siegel thing, which I'm about to describe, is going to be $150. It's a 2-day deal. It's going to be a long, long retreat. All of this you can sign up for today at our sign-up center that's on the front of the lawn. You can just go there. People have these Chrome laptops, and they'll sign you up immediately. You can pay immediately, get any questions you have answered, and they've got flyers, and so there's some flyers like this all over, which talk about these 4 events. Now, a quick word about Dan Siegel. So Dan Siegel is this person I've been talking about an awful lot, particularly this past year because I've been a student of his. I was in class with him for 10 classes in Santa Monica. He is a child psychiatrist. He is also a neuroscientist on the faculty at UCLA and also has his own institute called the Mind Sight Institute. And his kind of threshold book is called Mind Sight, and in which he talks about how our brains and our minds are different, but they work together, and how important it is to understand how your brain works, but also to understand how your mind is impacting your brain. And there's a third point in the triangle that he talks about: mind, brain, and relationships, because it's all of one piece. Now, he's part of the neuroscience global community who have been working with the Dalai Lama on examining the neuroscientific impact of meditation or mindfulness. So he's been in a great deal of conversation with the Dalai Lama and the entire Tibetan Buddhist community. Dan was raised in a Jewish secular scientific home which had its own ideological no-nos, and the taboos in his home were to think about anything having to do with religion and spirituality. Well, all of us know what that does to a kid. He, over the course of his life, began to find that to the degree he practiced mindfulness or meditation, and that he had his psychiatric patients do the same thing, that both their relationships and their brain functioning increased. Then he's written an awful lot about this. He's just got some hardcore neuroscience books. The first one that Hope and I, my wife and I, were turned on to is a book called The Whole Brain Child, which he co-wrote with Tina Payne Bryson from here in Pasadena. And then he's written a book on on the adolescent brain called Brainstorm, and he spoke here about it. And he's recently now gotten a book out called No Drama Discipline, in which he equips parents not to get into the drama that their child may slip into and stay in the prefrontal cortex and the mammalian brain instead of down in the reptilian brain where a lot of that kind of reactive drama is taking place. And interestingly enough, I have to put in this parenthesis, a member of our parish who has been reading No Drama Discipline wrote me and said, you know, it was in the wake of the non-indictments of the police officers who had killed unarmed African-American men. He said, what if the police forces of America read No Drama Discipline and found out that they don't have to go where somebody who's having a really, really bad day, to quote Greg Boyle, you know. And so we're going to invite the Pasadena police force to come and join this retreat with us. Pray for us. Pray for us. So last year, Dan, he was telling us about this in our class that we were having in Santa Monica. He developed a retreat called Soul and Synapse. Well, I immediately went up to him after the whole thing and I said, will you do the retreat at All Saints? Because he had just done this retreat. And he said, yeah. And so this is going to be the second time he's ever offered the Soul and Synapse retreat. And I asked him if we could stream it and videotape it. And he said, absolutely not. This is not a teaching. This is going to be an actual retreat. I'm going to be leading people in periods of meditation. I'm going to do a little didactic stuff about the impact of the meditation on your brain functioning and on your relationships. But we're actually going to be spending time meditating. So he's going to be with us most of the Saturday, February 7, and all of Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon on February 8. And it's going to be a retreat. And if we have enough registrants, we'll go into the church, hopefully, and do it there as a kind of a meditative, sacred space. So you won't be the same if you come to this thing. And I think you're not going to be the same, and I don't think any of us is going to be the same. I don't think All Saints is going to be the same after we all get into this stuff and really immerse ourselves in it and let it transform us. I mean, Richard Rohr says, the pain that is not acknowledged and transformed gets transmitted. And so we're here about stopping the transmission of toxicity, meanness, pettiness, small-mindedness, war, injustice, racism. We're bringing peace to the Middle East by 5 o'clock on March 1st. If y'all will come and get into this stuff. So, ready for questions? So what we're going to do is we're going to keep these microphones and we will simply repeat the questions you ask. So here's a comment and here's the second one. Yes?
It's Saturday to Sunday.
So that sheet is incorrect to that degree. And so please make a note. It's going to be on Saturday, Sunday, February 7, 8. I think those are the right dates. I'm almost certain those are the right dates. It's the day is wrong. All right. There was a question in the back. That was the same question. Pardon our mistakenness here. So, yes. Please, sir, if you'll stand and ask your question, then we're not going to have hand mics. I'm going to repeat because we're going to repeat it.
Yeah, as a person born into the Baptist Church, American Baptist in Episcopalian, I just returned from a retreat at the Order of the Holy Cross, and one thing I always believe in is our baptism transforms us so that we are those people who are loving and inclusive and inspiring with the greatest humanity that we know.
Great question. Yeah. So Justin is simply talking about coming out of a particular Baptist orientation where baptism was an immersion in the central commandment that Jesus said, that it's all about loving God with all your being and your neighbor as yourself. What's inadequate about that? Absolutely nothing. And what has been done with that is that you ain't got it and you don't have it unless you get baptized the way I was baptized. And so what we're doing is saying there's something even, and this is the radicalness of Celtic theology, which comes from John Philip Newell, is there something even more basic and inclusive and transformative than baptism? Because sometimes baptism is held up as the condition by which you get all this other stuff, or you live this way.
When I say that I love God, when I say God, there are images, ideas, and pictures of what that God looks like. All of us have that. When we say the name God, we have limitations to what we can see and understand. So loving God is wonderful. God is infinitely and immensely lovable, but we need to see, once we see that God more and more for who God is, the love doesn't have to be such a struggle and strain anymore because it's absolutely beautiful and wonderful. And unfortunately, a lot of us have images of God that are not the real God, but they're our projections of our parents or whatever images that we have come up with from our stories. So the coherent narrative, again, is undoing these illusions and seeing God more clearly so that love becomes more real and deep and grounded.
Yeah, I think along with that, you know, a lot of those narratives, I mean, we know that. We take in things, stories about ourselves and about God that are so ingrained that we don't even know sometimes what those are until we are in a community talking about it, or in an interfaith community, you know, that makes us aware of what hidden stories there may be, you know, about God. So I think that is part of what's really exciting about doing this in our parish. And, you know, I've been here a long time. And when this parish gets a hold of things, with all of you and reworks that together, I am so excited about what is going to come out of it, right? That I think part of it is that. Go ahead.
Your enthusiasm is contagious. I can just feel it. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. In business, we call something the BHAGs, the big, audacious goals. So I want to follow you. Tell me what it's going to be like in your hearts, in your 50, 100 years from when we're not here. Tell me where that is. I'd love to get my head in the heart.
Repeat the question for us and then answer it.
So in business terms, big, hairy, audacious goal, looking ahead 100, 200 years, I want to go with you on this ride. Where are we going to be down the road? What's the goal and the vision? I love that question, and I love the idea that we don't know. We don't know what things are going to look like in 10 years or 20 years. So embracing the value of unknowing is first for me, is going into the mystery, expecting surprise, expecting things that we're not thinking of right now. And with that, one thing that I can say is true, though, is that I keep coming back to the fruits of the Spirit, as Paul talks about: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. I don't know where all this is heading, but I do know that it's going to look more like the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
I really do agree with that. I want to say two more things about it. This really is based in an evolutionary spirit, which is another way of saying what John just said. Elia DeLeo, Richard Rohr, John Philip Newell, and Corton, and Dan Siegel are all talking about, Dan's not so much talking about God, but these other people are talking about expressing who God is when we acknowledge that we are children of Einstein and evolution, as much as we're children of Newton and mechanistic physics. And in the evolutionary theology that is being articulated and that we are going to help articulate, when you understand that all of us and everything that is came from one little cell 14.5 billion years ago, then whenever you take a snapshot, that is not all of reality, because we are more evolved now than when you ask your question. And that we're going to be more evolved this afternoon than we are now. And so you can't predict. However, having said that, here's my second point. And it's another way of saying what John said. Dan Siegel will, I think if he were here, he would say, what I can tell you will be new for you is that you will have a new level of a sense of well-being, which, and he loves the following word, the Greeks called eudaimonia, which is a sense of harmony, love, and joy. So you will, to use my South Georgia Baptist stuff, you'll be a person who has glory attacks all the time. Because your brain, your relationships, and your mind, all three, are pumping on all cylinders. Next question. Yes, please. Jean.
Please forgive me for asking, but I think $150 is very expensive. And I just wonder why you're charging so much.
The question is, why are we charging $150? That's how much it costs. Well, we don't have the money in our budget to pay for this. And unfortunately, we have to pay up on things like this. So if there are people who really are strapped, then we have a way for you to talk with John about a partial scholarship. But it's in order for us to have something like this, we have to pay the bills for it. Please.
I'd like to push on one part of this, because you're talking about a new narrative that is more basic than the stories that we're carrying around that we've been raised with, if I'm hearing you right. And I want to know, what's the difference between that and another narrative that stands alongside, in a pluralistic universe, the other ones? Could you speak to that?
So when we're talking about new narrative, we're talking about something that is, I'm asking his question. His question is, when you all are talking about a new narrative, then what is to preclude our talking about something that's all-encompassing, or are we talking about a pluralism of narratives in the world? And I think the answer has to be the latter, that we're talking about a pluralism of narratives, because our job here, I don't think, is to come up with the dogmatic narrative. Richard Rohr talks about an alternative orthodoxy. And so we're talking about an alternative narrative that we hope is more comprehensive and inclusive than the narratives we've been functioning on. And let's all admit, let's have some time to acknowledge the fact that the narratives we've been working by and the prevailing narrative that we have for the globe ain't working. And we've got to have something new that's more comprehensive and inclusive. And so that's what we're reaching for. And I don't think it will be the new orthodoxy. My favorite line from Andrew Basevich is that he distrusts all orthodoxies. He says, orthodoxy is a sham. So we're not here to establish a new dogma, but rather a new story, I love the image of the new song that we will sing and will continue to evolve. So it is 11 o'clock, time to go to church. Thank you so much. Go to the sign-up center and sign up. Thank you.